The morning after High Speaker Kethral's private visit to Ambassador Yoon Seo-jin, the grand chamber of the conclave filled with delegates who sensed that something fundamental was about to change. Rumors had spread through the station overnight. Whispers about secret meetings and unexpected visitors, and the impossible sight of the Valorian High Speaker walking alone through corridors. Meant for servants, no one knew what had happened. Everyone knew that something had. Kethral entered the chamber. With the stiff posture of someone walking to their own execution, his scales showed colors that the other Valorians present had never seen their leader display. Shades that spoke of resignation and acceptance and the death of certainties that had ruled his entire life. He took his place at the highest seat in the chamber and looked down at the single chair at the bottom where Ambassador Yoon sat with her hands folded and her expression peaceful. The Valorian Dominion withdraws all accusations against the human government, he announced without preamble. The chamber erupted in sounds of shock that echoed off the ancient stone walls. Delegates turned to each other with expressions of disbelief, while advisors frantically searched their devices for explanations that did not exist. Kethral waited until the noise subsided. The outpost in the Reaching Nebula will be allowed to continue its operations without interference, he continued. Furthermore, the Valorian Dominion will not pursue any claims to the nebula or its contents. He paused, and his gaze found Seo-jin across the vast distance of the chamber. This matter is closed. He sat down without explanation or justification. Valorian delegations sat in stunned silence around their leader, unable to comprehend the complete reversal of everything they had worked toward. The other empires watched with the careful attention of predators, sensing weakness in a rival. But no one spoke against the Valorians. No one mocked them or demanded explanations, or tried to take advantage of their sudden vulnerability, because every delegate in that chamber understood that whatever had brought the Valorians to their knees could do the same to them, and none of them wanted to find out what humanity might due to an empire foolish enough to draw attention to itself. The session ended quickly after that. Delegates fled the chamber as if the walls themselves had become dangerous, rushing back to their ships to send urgent messages to governments that would not know how to respond. Ambassador Yoon remained in her seat, watching them go when the chamber was nearly empty. Intelligence Chief Dovan of the Khazari Federation approached her. He was an old being by Khazari standards, his 4 eyes dimmed with age but still sharp with the intelligence that had made him the most respected analyst in his government. "May I speak with you, Ambassador?" he asked. Seo-jin gestured to a seat near but Torvan settled himself carefully, his joints protesting the movement. "I have spent the past week studying your species," he said. "I have found patterns that disturb me, and I would like to understand them better. What would you like to know?" Seo-jin asked. "What is humanity truly capable of?" Torvan asked. "Not what you have done, but what you could do if you chose to." Seo-jin considered the question with the same calm patience she had shown throughout her time at the conclave. "We do not know," she finally answered. Torvan's eyes narrowed in confusion. "You do not know your own capabilities? We are still discovering them," Seo-jin said. "Humanity is young by galactic standards, and we are still learning what we can become." She looked toward the viewport where stars burned in the eternal darkness. "But we have learned one thing that I believe the galaxy taught us early. Those who speak are measured. Those who remain silent cannot be. And nothing is more powerful than potential that has never been defined." Torvan sat with her words for a long moment. "You terrify me," he finally admitted. "Your entire species terrifies me, and I have spent 40 years studying the most dangerous beings in the galaxy." "Good," Seo-jin said gently. "Fear keeps people cautious, and caution keeps people alive." She rose from her seat. "Humanity does not want enemies, Chief Torvan, and we do not seek conflict with anyone. We simply want to exist and grow and discover what we might become. But we have learned that the galaxy does not grant peace to the weak, so we have chosen to be something other than weak. Something that cannot be measured or predicted or understood. Something that makes even the greatest empires hesitate before acting against us. She walked toward the chamber exit. "If you want to know what humanity is," she said over her shoulder, "watch what we do, not what we say. Our silence speaks louder than any words ever could." Months later, long after the conclave had returned to its normal routines of argument and alliance, a message arrived at Earth's diplomatic headquarters from a source that humanity's analysts had never expected to contact them. The Ilfrani Collective, ancient and isolationist, had reached out for the first time in recorded history. Their message was brief. "When you are ready to speak, we will listen. Ambassador Yoon So-jin, now returned to Earth after her service at the conclave, read the message." In her office, overlooking the Pacific Ocean, she sat with it for 3 days, considering what it might mean, what doors it might open, what futures it might make possible. Then she composed a reply. She typed a greeting and an expression of gratitude for the contact. She typed questions about the Ilfrani's history and their knowledge of the ancient species that had used silence as humanity. Now did she type proposals for exchange programs and shared research and the kind of cooperation that might benefit both civilizations. And then she deleted everything she had written. She stared at the blank message for a long time outside her window. The sun set over water that stretched to horizons. Humanity was only beginning to explore. She closed the message without sending anything. The Ilfrani would understand. They had been watching long enough to know that humanity's silence was not absence. It was presence. Constant and patient and utterly aware. It was the sound of a species that had learned to speak in ways the galaxy had forgotten existed. It was the weight of potential unlimited by definition, and it would continue, quiet and steady and eternal, until the stars themselves burned out on 100 worlds across the galaxy. In throne rooms and war chambers and diplomatic halls, the rulers of empires looked toward the small planet called Earth. They watched the humans go about their lives, building and growing and reaching ever further into the void. They watched and they wondered and they feared because humanity said nothing. And in that silence, every empire heard the same terrible question echoing through the darkness between stars. What are they waiting for? And perhaps that was exactly what humanity wanted them to ask. Perhaps the question itself was the answer. Perhaps the greatest power in the universe was simply making others wonder what you might do next. Ambassador Yoon So-jin stood at her window and watched the stars appear one by one as night fell over Earth. She smiled, and she said nothing at all. The capital world of the Valorian Dominion was a planet of towering spires and endless oceans. A monument to 3,000 years of conquest and domination. High Speaker Cathrol had returned there in secret, leaving his delegation at the conclave station under the command of subordinates who did not know why their leader had fled. He stood now in the war chamber deep beneath the largest spire, surrounded by the military commanders who controlled the most powerful fleet in the galaxy. "We have been compromised," he told them, and watched their scales flush with the colors of shock and disbelief. He showed them the schematic, the complete map of every installation, every defense grid, every secret facility that the Valorians had spent centuries hiding from the other empires. "This arrived at my personal terminal," he said. Anonymous transmission with no origin point, and no trace of how it penetrated our security. The supreme commander of the Valorian fleet was a veteran of 40 campaigns, a warrior who had never retreated from any enemy in her long career. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "Have we determined if this information is accurate?" "We have," Cathrol replied. "Every detail matches our current deployments, exactly, including facilities that were constructed within the past month." Silence filled the war chamber as the implications settled over the gathered commanders. Someone knew everything about Valorian military capabilities. Someone had penetrated security systems that had never been breached in 1,000 years, and that someone had chosen to reveal this knowledge rather than use it. The humans, one commander said. And it was not a question. We have no evidence of that, Cathrall admitted. We have no evidence of anything except that someone wants us to know that we are not as secret as we believed. That is evidence enough, the Supreme Commander said. The timing cannot be coincidence, and no other species would benefit from this revelation. She turned to face the strategic display that filled one wall of the chamber. But why reveal it at all? If they have this information, they could have used it against us secretly, and we would never have known until our fleets were burning. That is what disturbs me most, Cathrall said. They have shown us that they can hurt us, but they have not hurt us. A threat, another commander suggested. No, Cathrall shook his head. A threat would have come with demands, and there were no demands attached to this message. He walked to the strategic display and stared at the points of light that represented Valorian territory. I believe it is a demonstration, he said slowly. They are showing us that they already know everything and that they have always known, and that nothing we do is secret from them. Impossible, the Supreme Commander said, but her voice carried doubt. We are the Valorian Dominion, and no species has ever penetrated our intelligence networks. Perhaps no species has ever bothered to tell us that they had. Cathrall replied. The war chamber fell silent again across the galaxy, aboard the Conclave station. Ambassador Yoon Seo-jin answered a knock at her door high speaker. Cathrall stood in the corridor alone, without guards or advisors, or any of the ceremonial trappings that usually surrounded him. He looked diminished somehow, smaller than he had seemed in the Grand Chamber. May I enter? He asked, and his voice carried none of the arrogance that had filled his accusations. Ajin stepped aside and gestured for him to come. In her quarters were small and simple. Nothing like the luxury that other delegations enjoyed. She had a bed, a desk, a viewport, and a small area for preparing meals. She had brought few possessions from Earth, because she had expected to need very little. Cathrall looked around the room with an expression she could not read. This is where humanity's ambassador lives, he said. A room barely fit for servants. It is comfortable enough, Seo-jin replied. Would you like tea? He stared at her as if she had spoken in a language he did not understand. Tea, he repeated. It is a drink from my homeworld, she explained, already moving to prepare it. We offer it to guests as a sign of welcome. She prepared 2 cups with the careful attention of someone who found peace in small rituals. When she handed him his cup, his hands trembled slightly. What do you want? He asked, and his voice was almost pleading. Tell me what humanity wants, and I will make it happen. Seo-jin sat in her chair and gestured for him to take the other. What do you want? High Speaker? That is perhaps the more important question. His scales flushed with colors she had not seen before. Something that might have been shame or confusion or both. I wanted to claim the Reaching Nebula, he admitted. There are ancient technologies there. Artifacts from species that died before the Valorians achieved spaceflight, and I wanted them for my people. I know, Seo-jin said calmly. Your outpost was in the way, and I thought you would be easy to remove, he continued. I thought a show of force at the Conclave would frighten you into compliance. I know, Seo-jin said again. Cathrall's cup shook in his hands. You knew from the beginning? You knew what I was planning before I made my accusation? Seo-jin sipped her tea. We knew before you knew. High Speaker. She watched his expression shift through fear and anger, and something that finally settled into a kind of exhausted acceptance. How? He asked. How does a species as small as yours know the secrets of the greatest empire in the galaxy? Seo-jin considered the question for a long moment. Because we listen, she finally said. Because while the great empires shout at each other across the void, we sit quietly and we watch and we remember. She set down her cup. Humanity learned very early that we could not compete with the galaxy on its own terms, and so we did not try. We built networks of information instead of fleets of warships. We studied every species we encountered, learned their languages and their customs and their secrets. We did not do this to threaten anyone. We did it to survive. Kethral's scales had gone pale, almost white. The incidents, he said, the Dreth Collective and the Morvani Syndicate, and the others who suffered misfortunes after offending your people. Were those you? Seojin's expression remained calm. We have never taken any action against any species in this galaxy, she said, and her voice carried the weight of absolute truth. Everything that has happened to those who wronged us happened as a result of their own weakness. She paused. But we may have known about those weaknesses before they did. Kethral understood then, perhaps for the first time, what humanity actually was. They were not conquerors or warriors or merchants. They were watchers. They learned everything about everyone, and they waited until that knowledge could work in their favor. They never had to attack anyone, because they knew exactly when and how their enemies would destroy themselves. What will you do with what you know about us? He asked. Seojin smiled gently. That depends entirely on what you do next. High Speaker. He sat in silence for a long time, holding his untouched tea, staring at this small human woman who somehow held the fate of his empire in her quiet hands. I will withdraw the accusation, he finally said, publicly and completely. Seojin nodded once. And we will not pursue the artifacts in the nebula. Seojin nodded again. And the Valorian Dominion will not trouble humanity again. That would be wise. Seojin agreed. He rose to leave, then paused at the door. We are not enemies, she said, before he could speak. Humanity has no interest in war or conquest or domination. We simply want to exist in peace. But we have learned that peace must be protected. And sometimes the best protection is making certain that no one knows what we might do if pushed. Kethral left without another word, but he understood now why every empire in the galaxy should fear the species that said nothing at all. 1 week had passed since Ambassador Yoon Seo-jin had shaken the foundations of galactic politics by doing nothing at all. The Grand Conclave had reconvened 3 times in that week, each session more chaotic than the last, each attempt to address the human question dissolving into arguments that went nowhere and accusations that meant nothing. The Valorians had demanded a vote on sanctions against Earth. They had spent days gathering promises of support from empires who owed them favors or feared their wrath. High Speaker Kethral had announced that the vote would proceed at the 4th session, confident that he had secured enough allies to crush humanity's defiance. Then, 3 empires had withdrawn their support overnight. The Tessari Union had cited internal review processes. The Broken Worlds Coalition had claimed scheduling conflicts. The Merchant Princes of Kolar had simply stopped responding to communications entirely. No. One new white Thrill stood in his private chambers aboard the Valorian flagship and watched his carefully constructed alliance crumble. His advisors had no explanations. His intelligence officers had no answers. Humanity had contacted no one since the first session. They had made no threats, offered no bribes, formed no secret alliances. Ambassador Yoon had spent the week reading in her quarters, taking walks through the station's public gardens, and eating meals alone. She had spoken politely to anyone who approached her, but had offered nothing about her government's intentions, and yet 3 empires had abandoned the Valorian. 'Cause without explanation, Kethel's scales flushed with colors that his servants had learned to fear. Find out what the humans have done, he ordered his intelligence chief. I do not care how you do it or what laws you break in the process. His intelligence chief bowed and left to carry out orders that both of them knew would produce nothing in the Grand Chamber. The 4th session began with tension thick enough to taste. The delegations had arranged themselves differently than before. Seojin noticed the Kisari Federation had moved their seats slightly away from the Valurian section. The Morvani Syndicate had positioned themselves near the exits. The Ilfrani collective sat in their usual place, but their ancient eyes moved constantly, watching everything, missing nothing. Ambassador Yoon took her seat at the bottom of the chamber and folded her hands and waited. Kethrol rose from his throne with the rigid posture of someone barely containing rage. "Before we proceed with the vote," he announced, "I call upon any delegation with concerns to voice them now." Silence held the chamber for a long moment. Then, the eldest of the Ilfrani rose from her seat. The chamber went absolutely still. Ilfrani had not spoken in open session for over 200 years, they observed. They recorded, they remembered, but they did not participate until now. Ancient being moved to the speaking platform with the slow grace of something that had existed long before the stars around them had been born. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of millennia. "This conclave believes it understands power," she said, and her words seemed to echo from walls and floors and the shadows themselves. "This conclave believes that power is measured in ships and weapons and territory, and the willingness to use violence against those who are weaker." She paused, and her gaze swept across every delegation in the chamber. "We Ilfrani have watched this conclave for 3,000 years, and we have seen empires rise and fall according to these beliefs." Her eyes came to rest on Seojin. "But we remember longer than 3,000 years." The chamber was so quiet that Seojin could hear her own heartbeat. 10,000 years ago, the Ilfrani elder continued, "Before this conclave existed, before most of the species present here had developed language, there was another species that responded to aggression with silence." She turned to face Kethrol directly. 3 empires declared war on that species, certain that silence meant weakness, certain that their fleets would crush a species too afraid to fight back. Her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried to every corner of the chamber. "Those 3 empires no longer exist." Kethrol's scales went pale. "The silent species also no longer exists," the elder added. "But their end came from causes unrelated to those wars, and it came 2,000 years after the empires that attacked them had been reduced to ruins." She began walking back toward her seat. "We do not know if humanity is like that ancient species," she said. "We do not know what humanity is capable of or what their silence means." She settled into her seat with the careful movements of extreme age. "But we remember what happens when empires assume that silence equals weakness." The chamber remained frozen in the wake of her words. No one moved. No one spoke. Not even Kethrol, finally a minor delegate from the Tasari Union, raised a trembling hand. "In light of this information," he said, his voice cracking, "the Tasari Union formally requests that the vote be postponed until further study can be conducted." 3 more delegations immediately seconded the request. Kethrol looked around the chamber and saw his alliance dissolving like ice in the sun. He had promised the Valorian High Council a swift victory over the upstart humans. He had promised them submission and reparations and a demonstration of Valorian power that would remind the galaxy who ruled the reaching nebula. He had not promised them whatever this was. "The vote is postponed," he announced, and the words tasted like poison in his mouth. The session dissolved into chaos as delegations rushed to consult with their governments. Amidst the confusion, no one noticed a small communication drone arrive at the Valorian flagship. No one saw the single data packet it delivered to Kethrol's personal terminal. No one witnessed the high speaker's face as he opened the message and found a complete schematic of every Valorian military installation across their entire territory. The message had no origin point. It made no demands. It contained no threats. It was simply information delivered anonymously, proving that someone knew everything about Valorian defenses, and the implications of that knowledge hung in the air like the silence that had caused it all. Kethrol stared at his screen. and felt something he had not felt since childhood. Something no high speaker of the Valorian Dominion should ever feel. He felt afraid across the station. Ambassador Yoon Seo-jin walked through the public gardens with a cup of tea in her hands. She found a bench beneath a tree that had been transplanted from a world whose name she could not pronounce, and she sat and watched the artificial sun move across the artificial sky. Her communication device remained silent. Earth would contact her when Earth had something to say. Till then, she would wait. She was very good at waiting. All of humanity was perhaps their greatest gift. This ability to exist in the space between action and reaction, to let silence do the work that words could never do. The empires of the galaxy had built themselves on noise, on declarations and demands and the constant assertion of their power. They had forgotten that silence was a language too, and humanity spoke it fluently. Intelligence Chief Torvan of the Khazari Federation had spent 40 years learning to read species the way other beings read books. He had studied the Valorians and their hunger for territory, the Morvani and their addiction to profit, the Ilthrani and their ancient secrets that they would die before revealing. He had believed that he understood every species of significance in the galaxy. Now he sat in his office aboard the Khazari delegation ship and stared at his screens and realized that he had never bothered to understand humans at all. The reports from the Grand Chamber session filled his display, each one more confused than the last. Ambassador Yoon had said nothing. The reports agreed. But beyond that simple fact, no one could agree on what her silence meant. Some analysts believed it was a sign of weakness, proof that humanity had no defense for their actions and had simply frozen in terror. Others believed it was a cultural misunderstanding, some human ritual that the conclave had failed to account for. A few suggested that the ambassador had simply gone mad from the pressure of standing alone against the 12 empires. Torvan believed none of these explanations. He had watched the recording of the session 17 times now, focusing not on the chaos that followed, but on the ambassador herself. She had not been afraid. She had not been confused. She had looked at Kefral and at the assembled empires with the calm patience of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and that terrified Torvan more than any fleet of warships ever could. He pulled up the Khazari Federation's files on humanity and began to read them with fresh eyes. Earth had been contacted 53 years ago by a Marvani trading vessel that had stumbled upon their system while fleeing from a business arrangement gone wrong. The traders had expected to find primitives barely capable of reaching their own moon. They had found instead a species that had already sent machines to the edges of their solar system and had begun reaching for the stars with a determination that bordered on obsession. In the decades since first contact, humanity had done very little to attract attention. They had established a handful of colonies on worlds no other species wanted, built a small merchant fleet that traded in goods of minimal value, and maintained diplomatic relations that were polite but never warm. They had been quieter. Von paused on that word and felt something cold move through his chest. They had been quiet. He began searching deeper, pulling records from sources that most beings did not know existed. He found the incident with the Dreth Collective 12 years ago. The Dreth had been a minor power, arrogant and cruel, and they had insulted humanity's first official delegation at a trade conference by refusing to acknowledge their existence. Human ambassador had said nothing in response. 2 years later, the Dreth economy had collapsed when their entire financial network suffered a catastrophic failure. Investigators had found no evidence of external interference. The Dreth had blamed internal corruption and incompetence. They were no longer a significant power. Torvan found the incident with the Marvani Syndicate 8 years ago. A syndicate vessel had seized a human cargo ship carrying medical supplies. claiming that the humans had violated a trade agreement that did not exist. The human government had filed a single formal protest then. They had said nothing more 7 months later. The Morvani Syndicate's communications network experienced a series of cascading failures that took 2 years to fully repair. The syndicate had blamed outdated infrastructure. They had never bothered humanity. Agentorvan found 6 more incidents spread across the past 50 years. Each one followed the same pattern: an insult or attack against humanity, a brief formal response, then silence, and then, months or years later, the offending party suffered some catastrophic but seemingly unrelated failure. No evidence ever connected these events to humanity. No accusations could be made because there was nothing to accuse, but the pattern was there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice. Edervan leaned back in his chair and tried to understand what he was looking at. Either these were coincidences, the random misfortunes of a chaotic galaxy striking down those who happened to have wronged a minor species, or humanity was something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. He thought about the ambassador sitting in the Grand Chamber, silent and still while Kethril raged above her. He thought about the calm in her eyes, the patience, the absolute certainty. She had not been afraid because she had known something that no one else in that chamber. Neutervon began composing a report to the Kesari High Council. He wrote and deleted and wrote again, struggling to put his fears into words that would not make him sound insane. Finally, he settled on a simple message: we have been treating humans as prey because they are small and new and weak by our standards of measurement, but I believe we have miscategorized them, and I recommend that the Federation take no action against Earth until we understand what we are actually dealing with. He sent the message and then sat in the darkness of his office for a long time across the station. Ambassador Yoon Seung-jin was eating dinner alone in her quarters. She had prepared a simple meal from supplies she had brought from Earth, foods that reminded her of home and helped her stay calm in this place, so far from everything she loved. Her communication device remained silent. Other delegations had not contacted her. Though she knew they were watching, the Valorians had not contacted her. Though she knew they were planning, Earth had not contacted her because Earth trusted her to do what needed to be done. She finished her meal and cleaned her dishes, and then sat by the viewport to read a book she had brought from home. It was a collection of old stories from her grandmother's village, tales of clever rabbits who outwitted tigers and patient farmers who outlasted floods. She had read these stories 100 times since childhood. They had taught her everything she needed to know about power. The galaxy believed that power came from fleets and weapons and territory. The galaxy believed that strength meant crushing your enemies before they could crush you. Galaxy had built its empires on fear and violence and the certainty that might made right. Humanity had learned a different lesson. Humanity had learned that the unknown was the most powerful force in the universe. No one feared what they understood. Everyone feared what they could not predict, and nothing was more unpredictable than silence. Sizyojin turned a page in her book and smiled at a story about a rabbit who defeated a wolf by simply refusing to run. The wolf had expected fear and flight and the thrill of the chase when the rabbit sat still and watched him with calm eyes. The wolf had not known what to do. He had circled and growled and threatened, but he had not attacked because he could not understand why the rabbit was not afraid, and that uncertainty had saved the rabbit's life. Outside the viewport, the ships of the 12 empires drifted through the darkness, carrying beings who believed they ruled the galaxy. They did not yet understand that their rule depended on everyone playing by their rules, and humanity had just stopped playing. The Grand Conclave of the 12 Empires hung in the void between three dying stars. A station so massive that entire civilizations had risen and fallen in the time took to build just one of its wings. Ambassador Yoon Seo-jin stood at the viewport of her small quarters and watched shuttles carrying delegates from across the galaxy drift toward the docking bays like metal insects drawn to light. She had been here for 3 days now, and in that time she had learned more about galactic politics than 50 years of official contact had taught humanity. The lesson was simple. Everyone here was afraid of everyone else, and fear made them cruel. Her communication device chimed, and she turned away from the viewport to check the message. The session would begin in 1 hour, and she was expected to answer for crimes humanity had never committed. The walk to the Grand Chamber took 20 minutes through corridors lined with artwork from 1,000 worlds. Sejin passed diplomats from the Kesari Federation who stepped aside when they saw her coming, their 4 eyes blinking in what she had learned to recognize as nervous curiosity. She passed traders from the Marvani Syndicate who watched her with expressions that reminded her of merchants sizing up cheap goods. She passed soldiers from the Valorian Dominion who did not step aside at all, forcing her to walk around them while they laughed at jokes she could not understand. Humanity had been granted observer status at the conclave 5 years ago. After decades of careful negotiation, they were the newest species here. The smallest, the weakest by every measure the galaxy used to determine worth. Earth had no great fleets, no ancient technologies, no conquered territories stretching across star systems. Earth had only its people and their stubborn refusal to disappear. The Grand Chamber was a sphere of polished black stone with seating arranged in rings that rose toward a ceiling lost in shadow. Each of the 12 empires had its own section, decorated in colors and symbols that meant nothing to Sig-jin, but clearly meant everything to those who displayed them. The human section was a single chair at the very bottom of the chamber, positioned so that everyone else could look down upon it. Seo-jin took her seat and folded her hands in her lap and waited. The chamber filled slowly as representatives from worlds she had only read about took their places. The Ilfrani collective arrived last. 7 ancient beings who moved like shadows and spoke only when they had something worth saying. Seo-jin had never heard them speak in her 3 days here. When the chamber was full, the Valorian High Speaker rose from his throne at the top of the room. Cathrol was tall even by Valorian standards, his scales shimmering with colors that shifted as he moved, his voice carrying easily across the vast space without any need for amplification. "We gather today to address a violation of sacred law," he announced. And the chamber fell silent. "The humans have established an outpost within the Reaching Nebula, territory that has belonged to the Valorian Dominion since before their species learned to walk upright." Seo-jin listened as Cathrol laid out his accusations with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Reaching Nebula had been claimed by the Valorians 3,000 years ago, he explained, and any presence there without Valorian permission was an act of war. He demanded that humanity withdraw immediately, pay reparations equal to 10 years of their planetary output, and submit to Valorian oversight for all future expansion. The other empires watched, with the bored interest of predators observing smaller predators fight over scraps. A few seemed amused by the spectacle of the mighty Valorians bothering to threaten something as insignificant as Earth. None seemed inclined to object. When Cathrol finished his speech, he turned his gaze directly towards Seo-jin. "The human representative may now respond," he said, and his tone made clear that he expected groveling. Seo-jin stood. The chamber shifted as hundreds of alien eyes focused on her, waiting for the desperate explanations, the frantic apologies, the pathetic attempts at negotiation that always came from species too weak to fight. She looked at Cathrol for a long moment. She looked at the representatives of the 12 empires, each of them secure in their power, their histories, their certainty that they understood how the galaxy worked. She bowed once, deeply, with perfect formality. Then she sat down and folded her hands in her lap. The silence that followed was unlike anything the Grand Chamber had experienced in 3,000 years of continuous operation. Catherall waited for her to speak. She did not speak. The Kasari delegates exchanged confused glances. The Morvani representatives whispered to each other in voices too low to carry. The Ylfrani simply watched, their ancient eyes unreadable. Ambassador Yoon, Catherall said, and there was an edge in his voice now. You have been given the opportunity to respond to these accusations. Seojin looked at him calmly. She said nothing. Do you not understand the severity of your situation? Catherall demanded, his scales beginning to flush with colors that Seojin had learned indicated anger. Your species stands accused before the highest authority in the galaxy, and you offer nothing in your defense. Seojin tilted her head slightly as if considering his words. Then she straightened and continued to say nothing. The chamber abutted in whispers that grew into murmurs that grew into something approaching chaos. No one had ever responded to accusations at the Grand Conclave with silence. There were procedures for denial, for acceptance, for negotiation, for surrender. There were no procedures for this. Catherall slammed his fist against his throne with enough force to crack the ancient stone. This is an insult, he roared. An insult to the Valorian dominion, to this conclave, to every empire that is gathered here in good faith. Seojin remained seated with her hands folded, and her expression peaceful. She did not flinch at his anger. She did not cower at his threats. She simply existed in her chair at the bottom of the chamber, small and still and utterly unmoved. An elderly Kasari delegate rose from his seat and raised a hand for attention. Perhaps, he suggested carefully, the human representative requires time to consult with her government before responding. Seojin turned to look at him. She shook her head once, slowly, deliberately. She did not require time. She had nothing to say. The session dissolved into arguments about procedure, about precedent, about what could possibly be done when one party simply refused to participate in the rituals of accusation and defense. Through it all, Seojin sat in her chair and watched and listened and remained silent when the chamber finally emptied hours later. She walked back to her quarters through corridors that seemed emptier than before. The diplomats who had ignored her now watched from doorways. The traitors who had dismissed her now whispered as she passed. Valorian soldiers who had laughed at her now stood aside to let her through. Something had changed in the Grand Conclave of the 12 empires. Something had shifted in the careful balance of power that had held for 3,000 years, and humanity had accomplished it without saying a single word. Seojin returned to her quarters and stood once more at the viewport, watching the ships of 100 worlds drift through the darkness. Her communication device remained silent. Earth had not contacted her with new instructions, because Earth had no new instructions to give. This had always been the plan. When you cannot win with strength, you must win with something else, and humanity had learned long ago that nothing was more powerful than the unknown.